Yo, imagine waking up one day and the world you knew, gone. Cities swallowed whole. Mountains reduced to islands. And the water? It's rising every single day, and let's dive into it.
All over the earth, the sea level suddenly rose, and many floods and tsunamis of unknown origin occurred. A powerful flood made the mountains tremble, and the whole world felt the wrath of the water disaster. But our hero, all this time, was sleeping so soundly that he did not hear anything, and only the ringing of the alarm clock could wake him up. He felt very badly. His head was just glowing with pain. Our protagonist's name was Su Yi, and he was to be blamed for it. He had made this mistake again, even though he had promised himself many times not to. No matter how important a client is, you don't need to drink so much with him. After all, it was more important to get a deal or not how much alcohol he put into himself and the client. The next day's hangover was terrible, and he had to go to work in such a state. Su Yi was about to put on his house slippers as usual, when suddenly, he put on his wet slippers and walked straight into the water. He didn't expect this, and the only logical explanation was that he had drunkenly left the tap running yesterday and flooded his apartment. But after checking all the taps, it turned out that everything was fine with them, and with the pipes too. Now this whole situation became really strange, because he lived on the top floor, and from above none of the neighbors could flood him. Fortunately, he didn't have anything valuable in his apartment anyway. So Su Yi decided to just air out the place first, and deal with everything else after work. He opened the curtains to let in the sunlight, and just froze in surprise. Outside the window, instead of the usual view of a busy city and thousands of people rushing about their business, there was water. Seawater with waves. No matter where he looked, it was everywhere, and only all sorts of floating debris floated on its surface. Su Yi simply couldn't believe his eyes. How was this even possible? The only thing visible from under the water were the tops of the tallest buildings in his city. Everything else was buried in the blue abyss. It was so hard to believe that at first Su Yi thought he was just seeing hallucinations after last night's drinking. Unfortunately, these hallucinations were very persistent and were not going anywhere. No matter how much our hero closed his eyes, the view outside the window didn't change a bit. The realization of the reality of what was happening hit him like lightning. He jumped away from the window in horror. This is not a hallucination or a dream. Now this is the cruel reality in which he lives. Everything fell into place, and it became immediately clear why the entire floor of his apartment was in water. But still, the question remained. Could Su Yi have gotten so drunk yesterday that he didn't notice that the whole city had gone underwater? The first thing that came to his mind was to look for other survivors. Maybe some of his neighbors were still in their apartments and could tell him what had happened. Su Yi went to the first door along the hallway and started knocking, asking if anyone was home. No one answered, but he kept knocking, demanding a response. Suddenly, the door opened on its own. All because it was simply unlocked. Inside, he was greeted by chaos and scattered things. Apparently, his neighbors were packing in a hurry. There were no people inside, and the dog, which always prevented our hero from sleeping with its barking and howling, was also gone. It felt like this room had been abandoned long ago. Still, Su Yi thought it was strange that it was the first time in the history of their city to be hit by such a massive flood in just one night. Judging by the scattered belongings and the state in which everything was left, the neighbors, as soon as they heard about what was happening, immediately rushed desperately to escape, throwing everything over and forgetting to close the door. And it turns out that only our hero, because of the fact that he was sleeping rough after a drunken binge, remained the only one in the whole building, while the others fled to a safer place. Although, if you take a closer look and think about it, that can't be the case. Even if they escaped yesterday, how could there be such a thick layer of dust here? And the food couldn't have spoiled so quickly. It's like it's been weeks since they left the apartment. In fact, it was hard to imagine that even a massive flood could submerge an entire city in a miserable half a day. Su Yi had a faint hope for a phone, but unfortunately, there was no signal, and even the emergency services didn't answer. The whole thing was strange. Was our hero the only one left here? Well, even if he wasn't going to give up. Even if he had no idea what had happened, he wasn't going to do nothing. First, we had to find out if there was any way out. Of course, the elevator didn't work. And as it turned out, the stairs were flooded too. The water had gotten all the way to the top floor. It was cold to the touch and seemed lifeless at first glance. However, as soon as he lightly touched the water, a few meters away from our hero, it boiled. This was something he hadn't expected. A dark shadow began to float to the surface. A human head appeared from the water and startled Su Yi. It was a dead woman, and one look was enough to realize that there was something wrong with the corpse. It was floating to the surface, and as soon as her mouth was out of the water, it opened and 4 tongues emerged at once, or red petals of a strange plant. Su Yi could do nothing but stare in horror as the rest of her body also floated to the surface of the water. From the woman's chest, something resembling tongues also burst out. It now looked as if some sort of parasite was now living inside her. Su-yi realized in horror that this woman was the resident of the 29th floor. Su-yi froze at the sight of the dead body. He was still not at all used to such common apocalypse attributes as dead bodies. However, he couldn't take his eyes off the body, and concluded that it looked like it had been underwater for several days and was now swollen. There were inhuman features on the body, and another thing Su-yi noticed was that her hands had been chewed by something. Only the bones of the hand remained. This could mean that there were fish in the water, or worst of all, something much worse than fish, something different and terrible. Monsters of the deep that lurk below and await careless prey, and the darkness below moved suspiciously, confirming our hero's hunch. So there was no way out, at least not here. In that case, it was necessary first of all to take care of survival here, at least for some time, and to gather the necessary supplies. The most important were food supplies, and it was important that they had a long shelf life. Next, it was necessary to find weapons for self-defense and necessary tools. Dry and clean clothes were also needed. Su-yi also did not forget about the need for fire sources and stocked up on them properly. In short, he needed to imagine that he was on an uninhabited island with limited supplies. But surviving here was only part of the problem. His main concern now was a plan to escape from here. There were several options for that. The first was to just stay here, live quietly, and wait for rescue. He could climb on the roof and set fire to some junk in order to signal for help with smoke. In parallel, it will also be necessary to go through the apartments of neighbors and see if they still have some supplies. Eventually, if he was lucky, he would be found and rescued. If not, everything would finally go underwater and he would become fish food. That's quite a prospect, to be honest. It was all down to chance and luck, so Su-yi couldn't rely only on this option. The second option was more interesting. He had to make a raft. This was also a risky journey, but as a desperate measure, it was quite suitable. Therefore, Su-yi decided that when he had used up 75% of his supplies, he would take a risk and try to get out of here on a raft in search of rescue. But first he had to try the first option, and for that he had to light a fire on the roof. And just trust in fate. Maybe after the apocalypse it would smile on him. As soon as he entered the corridor leading to the roof, Su-yi froze in surprise. There were footprints under the water, human footprints. However, Su-yi was in no hurry to rejoice. Of course, it would be great if he wasn't the only survivor in the building, but there was one fact that frightened him. This someone had gotten here through the flooded staircase and entered the apartment of the couple that our hero had been in a couple hours ago. The question remained, how did he get here through the flooded staircase? He had to prepare for the worst. And before facing this stranger, Su-yi went to his room and armed himself properly. He was carrying the classic survivor's starter kit of a hammer and a butcher knife. The weapons gave Su-yi confidence, and he approached that apartment and asked if there was anyone alive inside. The sound of footsteps on the water and rustling came from the room. There was definitely someone inside. But the question remained, if it was indeed a living person, then why didn't he answer? Finally, a rotted foot emerged from the darkness. It was some kind of zombie woman, and she could already smell fresh flesh. When she looked out from around the corner, Su-yi immediately realized that things were bad. But before he could regain his senses, the zombie had already jumped. The darkness was not a problem for the zombie, but because of the darkness, Su-yi could not react in time, and it jumped straight at him. She was too close, and her crooked, chipped teeth were already snapping near our hero's face. Then Su-yi screamed that he wasn't going to die, and gathering his strength, pushed her further away with his foot. Of course, that didn't stop her, and after barely getting back on her feet, she rushed forward again. This time, Su-yi was already ready to use his weapon. As soon as she got close enough, she immediately received a refreshing hammer blow on her head. Surprisingly, it was enough to put this zombie to rest forever. Su-yi was unpleasantly surprised by the fact that there were zombies in the world and wondered if it could be due to the mutation caused by the flood. Suddenly, the zombie corpse glowed with a blue glow, and a system window appeared in front of our hero, saying that he had received 1 spiritual source out of 5. Of course, he had no idea what it was. Where could this system window come from, like some game, and what did this spirit source mean after all? Suddenly, he felt his body fill with power. Even the hammer in his hand became lighter. He himself was now glowing with the blue light that the dead zombie had glowed with a moment ago. Su-yi now had the feeling that something had been absorbed into him. Had he earned a unit of this spirit source for killing the zombie? Apparently, this spirit source had an effect on his body, as the spot he had bruised during the battle no longer hurt. Moreover, all the fatigue was gone and Su-yi felt a kind of surge of energy. Even his strength had increased. Now he had to figure out what to do with the zombie corpse. He couldn't just leave it lying there, in case it would come to life again at night. The solution came naturally. He decided to feed that shadow floating near the exit. So he took the zombie by the leg and dragged it away. It seems the world has become a very different place, and it's a world he'll have to survive in. The Walking Dead, mysterious abilities, an unknown spirit source, and who knows what else. There was no way to explain what was happening in terms of common sense. It was unknown whether the changes that happened to this woman were accidental or imminent. But if all the corpses in the neighborhood looked like her now, then the city must have become an extremely dangerous place. After all, it was even hard to imagine how many people had died in the flood. Probably millions. In that case, it wasn't even a place that was safe. It was necessary to go out to rescuers as soon as possible. Sui climbed out onto the roof and gathered a pile of trash for the fire there. He also looked around again, and even though he had seen this sight many times before, he could barely contain his fear. How big the flood must be for the consequences to be so terrifying. Sui looked at the neighboring building, which also had 30 floors, and wondered if there were any survivors like him. But he wasn't going to puzzle over it for long. He would find out soon anyway. Sui quickly lit the signal fire and watched it burn brightly with hope. Unfortunately, time was passing, and the fire was almost burned out and nothing was happening. If there were any survivors nearby, they must have reacted upon seeing the thick smoke rising from the roof of his building. Indeed, the column of black smoke was visible very well, and surely many kilometers away. But the fire had finished burning and nothing happened. Even after half an hour, there was still a crashing silence around, broken only by the sound of the waves. The frustrated Su Yi began to walk back down, calculating that he only had enough food supplies for 4 days. Before he had gone a little way, he was forced to stop. There was water in his path, although he clearly remembered that when he first came here, the water had not reached the 30th floor yet. Now the entire section was flooded, so the water level was still rising. And even on the 30th floor, it wasn't safe to stay. Time was now playing against our hero, and he needed to build a raft as soon as possible. Su Yi didn't know what fate would prepare him tomorrow, so he had to be ready. Our hero immediately got down to work. And after just a few hours, he was already sighing after a successful job. Sui made a raft out of a few door frames, a bed frame, and a couple of drawers. Such a structure should be able to hold up to 300 kilograms. Fortunately, Sui already had experience in boat handling, as he had participated in boat races during his student days. And if he could make another paddle, he would surely be able to swim to the neighboring building. As a paddle, he decided to use a clothes hanger he found in one of the apartments. Before heading back to the raft, he looked out the window and lingered a bit longer. There he saw another drowning zombie that seemed lifeless and dangling among the waves. There had been no zombies here before. He remembered that well. Had the usual corpses mutated so quickly? Well, while the water level had not yet risen, Su Yi could use his height advantage to finish off the zombie before it got in. To do so, he attached a hammer to a hanger, and tried using the other end of the hanger to drag it closer. The zombie immediately came to life and tried to bite the hanger. Sui had expected such a twist. But then something strange happened. After the zombie moved, something dragged him under the water. Our hero didn't realize what was happening, and what's drowning this poor dead guy. The poor guy tried to fight back, but it didn't work, and long dark shadows dragged him down to the depths where no sunlight could reach. Only air bubbles remained where the zombie had been a moment ago. Sui was horrified by what he saw. He was so frightened that he quickly slammed the window shut and tried to catch his breath in terror. In this cursed water, besides corpses, there was something else much scarier lurking in the water. He remembered that the first corpse of a woman he had seen had bite marks. Now the safety of the raft he had worked so hard to build, hoping to leave this place as quickly as possible, was doubtful. If he tried to swim to another building on the raft, the aggressive creatures from the water could drown him before he could reach his goal. But staying here is not an option either. There's only 4 days worth of food left, and that's not to mention the fact that the water level is still rising and there are still many corpses that can mutate. Sui didn't have a moment's peace. Soon, lifeless hands started knocking and beating on the door of his apartment. Immersed in his musings, our hero only jinxed it. While he sat quietly, the zombie lost interest in his door and went to try to break through the other one. Su Yi decided to take a look. As expected, it was another zombie. It looked suspiciously like the one he saw in the water recently. His leg was broken. Those underwater creatures had almost chewed it off. But there was no telling how it would affect his mobility. Therefore, Su Yi decided to act and attack first. If he didn't, this zombie would still come to him. And now was the perfect moment for a sneak attack. The zombie only had time to roar one last time, before dropping dead after a precise hammer blow. 1 blow equals 1 dead zombie. That's quite a good efficiency. As Su Yi expected, he guessed correctly, and a system window appeared after killing the zombie. The progress of the spiritual source had now increased to 2 out of 5. It was just as he had thought. He had become stronger again. This meant that if he continued to kill these mutated corpses and obtain spiritual source levels, he could become even stronger. In that case, Suyi would have a hope of defeating not only ordinary zombies, but also those mysterious underwater creatures.